What is the most difficult instrument in the orchestra to play? The most difficult instrument in the orchestra to play is second fiddle, and it is important because if we don't have second fiddle, we don't have harmony. And today we want to talk about the idea that you can be successful, your team can be successful, as long as the people on your team don't care who gets the credit. And it's an important thing because in most teams, there are only a few people who are going to get the credit. You think about a football team winning the Super Bowl, and maybe the quarterback gets a credit, maybe a wide receiver gets a credit, maybe a coach gets a credit, but there's a whole lot of players on that team. And there's the player on that team, and there's assistants, and there's assistant coaches, and there's administrative staff, and so on. And everybody's got to do their job. And I'll tell you, in preacher world, if you were to say to your average preacher, I want you to be a great servant of God, and I want you to stand before thousands and see thousands and thousands and thousands come to faith in Christ. I tell you, your average preacher would say, sign me up, sign me up. But if you say to your average preacher, I want you to serve in obscurity. I want you to serve faithfully in a place where no one knows you. And I want you to block and you want you to tackle. I want you to preach and I want you to pray and I want you to visit and I want you to serve and no one will ever notice. Well, that is a more difficult task, but that is what God has called most of us to do, to serve in obscurity. So we're going to look today about a man by the name of Barak who didn't care who got the credit. Judges 4, again, the Israelites did evil. Can you believe it? Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now that Ehud, and that was the judges that before the story we're getting to now he was dead, and when the cat's away, the mice will play, and they sinned, and the cycle of the judges. If you Google Cycle of the Judges, you'll see some slightly different graphics that'll come up. I like this one because it's short and they all begin with S. But we start with our verse today in sin. They begin to sin. And by the way, we're around 1250 BC, and that's a good thing to remind your people of because most people know the stories of the Bible, but they don't know the story of the Bible. We want to remind our people of how the whole thing fits together. Verse 2, so the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Let me tell you a little feature of much of the Bible, by the way, that makes it a little bit hard to understand, but really helps us when we try to study it. And that is, the Bible is a little bit like someone was going to tell you a story about something that happened at Walmart. And he tells the story this way. I was going to Walmart. Well, on my way to Walmart, I had to stop and get gas. So when I got gas, they had those candy bars. My mother used to love those candy bars. I miss my mother. And then I had to stop and get a prescription on the way. And I stopped at CVS and got a prescription. And while I was there, I got a Coke. Not a Coke, but those other. And after a while, you think, what is a story is? In other words, some people tell a story that there's so much detail you get lost in the detail. A good story has enough detail. It has enough detail that you can kind of picture what's going on, but not so much as to confuse you. Now, the Bible, it looks like, has too much detail, but if you study the Bible, this detail actually helps us to put the whole thing together. But as you read, you have to kind of look for what is the extraneous detail, what is the clutter, if I could say that respectfully, in the story, and what is the central part of the story. There's 4 characters in the story that I want us to pay attention to. There's a political leader and a military leader, and there's a leader in Israel, and there's a leader in Canaan. And we're introduced here to the political leader in Canaan. He's introduced here as Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And a little later, he'll be described as king of Hazor. But you see here, this little detail that shows up here helps us to understand what they mean by king of Hazor. It'd be a little bit like if someone here in New Mexico was either called the king of Albuquerque or king of New Mexico. In either case, they're ruling over this region. And by the way, you can Google this and find pictures, and you ought to remind your people often that these are real places and real history that really happened back in the day. So we have sin, and then we have suffering, we have punishment. Sisera. Now we have a second person, the commander of his army, and I like to pronounce that name Sisera. Sisera reminds me of a snake, all right, because he's a bad guy. And that pronunciation, Sisera, will remind me that he is the military leader of the bad guys, all right? Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Harosheth Hagoyim. Google it and you can find out where this is. You see where Hazor was up on the north side of the Lake Galilee. because he had 900 chariots. And I read one commentary that said this was like the smart bombs and the drones of their day. This was the advanced weaponry of their day. 900 chariots fitted with iron, and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Finally, after 20 years, they cried out to the Lord for help. So now we're in that third phase, down in supplication. They have sinned. God sent punishment. Now they're crying out to God. Now Deborah, without any introduction, in a world dominated by male leaders, we're introduced to a female leader here without a lot of explanation. Deborah was a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time, and some translates it has it was judging Israel at this time. Now, these judges were generally speaking military leaders, although in the case of Deborah, she actually did some judging, and we see that in the next verse. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. Now she sent for Barak, fourth person. There was Jabin, there was Sisera, there was Deborah, political leader of Israel, and now the military leader of Israel, Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, lots of details there, but if you want to know where all this places was, you can work it out. So here's a little graphic that shows in Israel we have a political leader, Deborah, a military leader, Barak. In Canaan we have a political leader, Jabin, and a military leader, Sisera. The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men to go against their 900 chariots, 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. Now those are not people, those are places, those are tribes of Israel, which will function more like maybe counties at that time anyway, and lead them to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the bad guy, the military leader of Canaan, the commander of Jabin, the political leader, army, and his chariot and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course that you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. And I remember reading this when I was junior high or high school. I read through the Bible for the first time. And I remember reading this. It's funny. I've got a pretty bad memory, and a lot of things I don't remember, but I happen to remember this. I remember reading that and think, oh, Deborah is going to be the hero. Deborah is going to get the credit. Well, you go on and read the rest of the story. You're going to find out she doesn't. But it's not going to be him. He is going to have to yield the credit to a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. And because this is a little bit of a complicated story, one of the things I sometimes do when I want to familiarize myself with a story is I'll just do a search on YouTube, and I found a little cartoon, and it actually shows some insight into this story and into Barak and his response here. See what you can learn from this little cartoon.
The Lord sends you, not me, Deborah said. But it's okay. I will go with you. However, because of the way you are going to face the battle, victory will no longer be yours.
Oh.
God will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman.
Oh. Okay.
Okay, I like that. Okay, I think that's what he said. Okay, that's okay with me. I don't care who gets the credit. I only care that we win. Verse 10, there Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, these whole areas, these counties, I want to call them, these tribes, and 10,000 men went up under his command, and Deborah also went up with him. You can see in these two maps, one a zoomed in version of the other one, where this is in the northern part of Israel up there. Now Heber, who's Heber? Well, we haven't actually been introduced to Heber, and we're not told a lot. It seems to kind of come in out of the blue. But Heber, the Canaanite, and it's going to show up later, the Canaanite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zaanannim near Kadesh. When they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone to Mount Tabor, Sisera summoned from Heroshesh Hagoyim to the Kishon River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down to Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all the chariots of army by the sword, and Sisera got down from the chariot, and he fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Heroshesh Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a single man was left, except Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber. Do you remember a moment ago I said put a pin in that guy Heber? Well, here his wife is. So we come to Heber's tent, and Jael, his wife, is there, the Canaanite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber, the Canaanite. And here is a strange situation where a husband and wife do not agree, because Heber was on the bad guy's side, but Jael, the wife, was on the good guy's side. Jael went to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord," this tender little motherly statement here, "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blankie. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk. I don't know why she gave him milk. He asked for water. She gave him milk. I have no idea. Didn't find any commentators that said, and I don't see that it matters. But anyway, she gave him some milk, gave him some drink, and she covered him up with a blankie. Doesn't actually say banky there, as you can see. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her, as he's nodding off to sleep. "If anyone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone there?' you say, 'No.'" But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. So he's laying there. She drives this peg through the temple. It comes out maybe the other temple. And in case you missed it, in case you didn't understand it, this killed him. Curiously, there's a famous story that comes up in psychology about Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad worker, that he was pounding a metal rod into the ground to compress some gunpowder, and the gunpowder exploded. And the rod came through his head about here and out the middle of his head, and unbelievably, he lived through it. And it was kind of a study of psychology, because it did change his personality quite a bit. But in this case, Sisera died. Just then, Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went up in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, and in case you didn't notice, he was in fact dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. So we had sin, and then suffering, and then supplication, and now we have salvation. And the hand of the Israelites passed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. What do we learn from this passage? 5 observations. The first one is this: Barak was a man of faith. And you may say to yourself, I didn't see that in that passage. When we study Scripture, we ought to often ask the question, what does this passage say? And then ask the question, what else does the Bible say? The Bible is an excellent commentary on the Bible. If you do a search for the word Barak, you will find that he shows up in Hebrews. This is the faith chapter, 11:32. What more shall we say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, these others. And this is the passage on faith. You see these highlighted words here from Logos Bible Software. By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. And then at the very bottom down there, what more shall we say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak. And we see that he was a man of faith. Timothy Keller says, faith is showing courage in the face of humanly overwhelming odds. An iron chariot could cut through foot soldiers like a hot knife through butter. 900 chariots would beat 10,000 men every single time. But Barak still fights. He shows his faith through action. And that's observation number 2. Barak had a bias for action. He showed his faith by action. Barak said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. John Maxwell says, one of the great dangers for a thoughtful person, and we want to be a thoughtful person, but we don't want to do what he says here. We don't want to spend too much time in problem solving and too little time on solution implementing. Leaders who don't or can't follow through are in danger of thinking ready, aim some more, and we never get around to firing. And the solution is to develop a bias for action. Don't think, can I? Instead, think, how can I? Let's get it. Let's do it right now. There's a famous story of Lee Iacocca, and when he was the chairman of Ford, they had quit making the Mustang convertible. They still made the Mustang, but they quit making the Mustang convertible. And he was convinced it would be a hit. So he brought the idea to the board, and they said, well, that's a good idea, Lee. Let's think about that, and let's consider that, and let's do some focus groups, and let's do some surveys, and let's do some research, and let's study this, and let's get a feasibility study to consider this idea. And he said, no. We're going to go down to the shop floor right now, and we're going to get a Mustang about to come off the assembly line, and we're going to get a chainsaw, and we're going to cut off the top of this Mustang, and then 3 or 4 of us are going to run around Detroit this afternoon and just see what kind of looks we get. And they got some pretty positive feedback from that little experiment, and they brought back the Mustang convertible because Lee Iacocca was a man of action. And Barak was not only showed faith in action, but showed faith in instant obedience, in instant action. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day. This day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Don't wait till tomorrow. This day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went, and the idea is he went that very day. The measure of a man's faith is shown in part in how long it is between when God says go and when the person goes. It's a classic story of Abraham where God has called him to take Isaac up on the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. And early in that chapter, Genesis 22, we read, early the next morning. I believe for me, if I had the courage to do it at all, I would have dilly-dallied all morning long. And maybe my mid-afternoon, I'd have gone with it. But it speaks well of Abraham that early the next morning, he was a man of instant obedience. Adrian Rogers says, I'm talking about immediate obedience. Do you know that procrastination is a form of sin? When God speaks to you, do you know that procrastination is a form of sin? Is there anything you're procrastinating about that God has spoken to you about that you're going to get around to it when you get around to it and you never get around to it? Brian Tracy wrote this best-selling book called Eat the Frog. And the whole idea is if you've got 10 things to do and one is ugly like an ugly frog, eat that ugly frog first. Get it out of the way. Sometimes I find myself saying to myself, I do not feel like doing that. And I've caught myself recently thinking, you know what? I'm never going to feel like doing that. Let's just eat that frog right now. Let's just do it right now. Haggai 1:2 says, this is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. We're going to do it. We're going to get around. We're just not going to do it right now. There's a famous old mythical preacher story about the devil and his demons, and they're strategizing about how they can tempt mankind. And one says we'll do it through materialism, and another says we'll do it through sexuality, and so on. And then a third one comes forward and said, Mr. Devil, I have an idea. Let's tempt the people with righteousness. Let's tempt the people to follow God. And the devil got this puzzled look on his face, and he thought, what in the world is this guy thinking about? And he said, yes, let's tempt them to follow God tomorrow. And the devil thought that was the greatest idea ever. And indeed, many times, the devil will tempt us not to not follow God, but to not follow God right now. Fourth observation, Barak was a man of influence. He was able to summon 10,000 men to follow him. John Maxwell famously says, if you think you're leading and no one is following you, you're only taking a walk. Observation number 5, most important point. Barak was a man who didn't care who got the credit. Certainly I will go with you, Deborah said, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. And I picture Barak saying, that's okay with me. I don't care who gets the credit as long as we win the war. And if you want to play second fiddle well, you need to be a person like Barak who doesn't care who gets the credit.